Hello guys and welcome to my new video, and today we're going to be talking about my updated Resto Shaman guide, mainly looking at talent points, mainly looking at how my talents changed. I've looked at some of the other Resto Shamans running different builds. We'll talk about the talent changes for Totemic when it comes to Mythic Plus content. We'll talk about Farseer, we'll talk about raiding, and then we'll top it off with some of the tips and tricks in terms of how to manage your mana as Totemic, because that has been one of the most requested questions by a mile. Let's go and get started. And just a very quick update in terms of Farseer versus Totemic. Now in Mythic Plus content, Totemic has been kind of blasting or very popular for a lot of Resto Shamans, and I can see why that is. I've been playing Totemic a lot, and it is genuinely much easier to play than Farseer in my honest opinion. In terms of dealing damage, you just press your Surging Totem on a group of mobs and your Acid Rain is going to blast. And then you can do other things in between there. A lot of times if you're playing Farseer, people are really put off from the fact that you have to hard cast Healing Rain. A lot of people don't like that. They kind of miss the fact that certain totems are going to shoot out chain heals and things like that. But generally speaking, I see myself playing Farseer for higher keys, especially when mana is going to be a bit more of an issue when you're doing really high keys, really long bosses. I enjoy Farseer a lot, and I've been playing Farseer more and more, but I can see why so many people gravitating towards Totemic. It's easier to play, it's easier to deal damage with it, and on top of that, you kind of have less buttons to micromanage. Now, the downside of Totemic is mana issues, but we'll talk about that again at the end of the video. And my general advice still stands. Don't get overwhelmed by the amount of Resto Shamans playing Totemic and thinking that Totemic is the only way to play. Both of the hero builds are extremely strong in Mythic Plus content, and we'll probably see a lot of high-end Mythic Plus keys being done with both of those builds. My advice, try out both of them, see which one you resonate more with, see which one you like or prefer, and stick with it. I think Resto Shaman having multiple options is only a good thing. So let's go and talk about Totemic Resto Shaman build that has changed for me personally in the last couple of weeks based on my first initial Resto Shaman video. Now keep in mind, this is not the best talent build. There's probably like 5 or 6 different variations that I've seen Resto Shamans using that I've experimented with. So I actually encourage people to try out different builds and see which one kind of works for you, because I genuinely believe there's a couple of talent points that are kind of interchangeable. So first of all, in terms of Totemic, I'm still sticking with something like supportive imbuements, especially if I'm running a group where people are not standing on my Surging Totem and my Surging Totem is not really doing a lot of healing. I swap to something like supportive imbuements because, again, keep in mind, a lot of Resto Shamans might not even have a shield to play around with this. But I like this talent. I think it's interchangeable depending on your group and things like that. And I like Earth Surge. Now keep in mind, both of these talents, like in my initial video, you can play around with both of them and still have a good time with it. But this is something that I'm playing right now. And in terms of the spec tree itself, the things that have changed, people have been taking out points from this row specifically. And they've been playing around with different variations. For example, they take out points from Tidewaters and put it in something like Current Control, which means your Healing Tide Totem is going to have less of a cooldown, which honestly, I'm relatively happy about this. And I've been playing this a bit more and having a shorter cooldown on Healing Tide. You have Ascendance on 2 minutes, you have AG, you have a lot of decent cooldowns out that you can play around, you can combine, you can... Again, I'm not against this. I think this is probably going to stick. And again, play around with it. Outside of that, honestly, it's kind of wild west. I've been trying out lately running deeply rooted elements. Now, I'm not 100% sold on this right now, because sometimes you might get an Ascendance proc when there's a lot of healing needed and you're like, wow, this is a nice little boost to my healing. And then sometimes you might get Ascendance proc when there's absolutely nothing happening and you're like, this is a complete waste of time. So again, it really depends on the type of person and the type of content you're doing. Maybe you're doing dungeons where there's like consistent healing across the board all the time. But I'm not 100% sold on this. Some people might take a point out of this and put it in something like Torrents for more consistent healing increase. Again, I don't think there's absolutely amazing choices here. I've also seen a lot of Resto Shamans putting a point into Tidebringer. We will talk about Tidebringer later on. We do have to mention the fact that with Totemic, you're getting a lot of your free chain heals from lively totems. But I still think you can run Tidebringer depending on your circumstances. I've also seen Resto Shamans putting in points into improved Earth Living weapon, but I'm very wary of this right now because the Earth mode from Whirling Elements has multiple bugs with Earth Living, and putting in additional points into Earth Living, I'm not 100% sold on this right now. And what is the best build that I'm running as Resto Shaman in terms of Totemic Mythic Plus build? Honestly, I'm really enjoying the Current Control. I really like the reduced cooldown on Healing Tide Totem. And outside of that, honestly, it's kind of wild west. You can experiment with Tidebringer or without Tidebringer. You can experiment with things like deeply rooted elements. Some people might have points in Torrent. There's quite a few choices here that you can try out. I don't have a set build that I always run for every single Mythic Plus because I've been experimenting with a lot of them. Let me know which build you find to be the most successful when running Totemic in Mythic Plus. And now let's talk about Farseer Mythic Plus Chain Heal build. Basically, this is the build that I'm running when I'm not playing Totemic, and there's a couple of talent points that I've been personally experimenting with. I'm not sure what the best build is going to be in the future, but generally speaking, again, I'm playing with Healing Stream Totem. You can't play with Cloud Burst. I think it's more of a preference choice than anything else. But with this talent build, for example, I still stand by this. If you don't enjoy Primordial Wave, if you don't optimize it, if you don't press it, you don't have to play with this. I don't think it's the end of the world, especially with the current build that I'm showing you right now. So sometimes I actually take Primordial Wave out, and I think there's multiple options where you can place this point. For example, you can place it in Current Control for shorter cooldown on Healing Tide Totem. If you want, you can place it in Spouting Spirits. If you want, you can place it in Downpour. You remember, with Farseer, when you press Downpour, it counts like as an AoE ability, and your ancestors, if they're out there or if they're active, they're going to be pressing Chain Heal. So you can optimize that if you want. And I've seen a lot of Resto Shamans, or few Resto Shamans, also putting points or possibly putting points into deeply rooted elements as well. So I think there's multiple options here that you can play around, and I know there's a lot of people who don't like Primordial Wave. It has divided the community in a significant way, and I think you can play around without it if you really, really hate it. Now, let's say, for example, I put a point in something like Current Control, and I also like to, for example, mess around with Flow of the Tides. Now, with Flow of the Tides, Chain Heal bounces an additional time, and casting Chain Heal on a target affected by Riptide consumes the Riptide, increasing the healing of your Chain Heal by 30%. I'm playing around this because I have so many Riptide charges. You have Elemental Reverb, you have Echo of Elements, you have triple Riptide charges to play around. On top of that, offering from Beyond, when Ancestor is called, they reduce the cooldown of Riptide. So you have so many Riptides, and for example, if you're pressing a Chain Heal, maybe you have High Tide proc and you're about to press Chain Heal on someone that has Riptide on them, you will feel the power of that Chain Heal. So I've been messing around with a similar build like this. Again, the point in Current Control can be moved in multiple different directions depending on your preference. But keep in mind, guys, I'm not sure what the best build is going to be out there. I'm experimenting with multiple different nodes right now. Again, we talked about Flow of the Tides. You can experiment with Ancestral Reach. But I've seen a lot of people, again, running this build, and they're trying to take a point away from Primordial Wave, put it somewhere else. Again, in this example, I placed it in Current Control. Again, there is Resto Shamans running high Mythic Plus keys who also might try to free up a point from Tidewaters and then place it somewhere else. There's a couple of options that you can have. I've seen people running Deeply Rooted Elements. I've seen people running Downpour. There is quite a little bit of experimentation going on with Farseer Chain Heal build, especially with what you see right now. So in summary, there's quite a few different builds around. For example, a lot of people might be running something similar to this, but if you want something a little bit easier, for example, you can run Healing Stream Totem. You might hate Primordial Wave. You can spec away from this. You might want additional point to try out. You can spec away from Tidewaters as well. You can place it in multiple different locations. You can also try out Flow of the Tides. So I've been kind of going back and forth between one of the more standard builds to something that you see right now with multiple different options. Let me know which build you had the most success with as Restoration Shaman. And now let's quickly talk about Totemic Raid build, and this is probably going to be one of the most popular builds out there. There's a couple of alterations to this, but this is something that I've been running as a raiding Resto Shaman. Now Totemic can be pretty mana exhaustive, and we will talk about this later on, but generally speaking, I don't think you can go wrong with this. I think you can try out and play Cloudburst Totem. I think that's open depending on which playstyle you like. I do think that Healing Stream Totem is a lot easier to play, and I think a lot of people are going to gravitate towards the simplicity of that. Outside of that, you can drop a couple of points. Again, this is very dependent to pick up the Luge and maybe possibly even Acid Rain if you want to add additional damage as Resto Shaman, but I think for majority of people that's not really going to be applicable. Again, there are a couple of people who are experimenting with deeply rooted elements as well, but I've been enjoying Wellsprings a lot, and it is the most popular choice right now. So let me know how you feel about this build. Let me know what you would change, or maybe you've been having more success with something else. And let's move on to the last section of the video. Let's go and talk about how to save mana as Totemic Resto Shaman. Now keep in mind there's going to be tips and tricks in terms of saving or reducing the mana consumption as Totemic, but generally speaking, honestly, even if you follow these tips and tricks, it will or can have mana issues. Totemic Resto Shaman can be pretty exhausting, especially if you're doing really long fights. For example, I'm progressing on Mythic egg boss right now, and that's a 9-minute plus raid boss, and I have a very hard time of maintaining my mana as a Totemic Resto Shaman. I possibly will swap to Farseer. If you have mana issues regardless of these tips and tricks, Farseer is always an option because it doesn't chug mana as much as Totemic, so just keep that in mind. But the number one way of reducing the mana cost as Totemic, and this is something that I've seen a lot of Resto Shamans ignore and maybe not play around, is the fact that you have lively totems. So that means that, for example, if I press my Healing Stream Totem or Cloudburst Totem, again, certain totems are going to shoot out chain heals. And if I press them, you're only paying the mana cost of the totem. You're not paying the mana cost of the chain heal. And that is absolutely massive in the long run, whether it's going to be dungeons, whether it's going to be raids. It can save you so much mana, and if you can play around it, it can be really good. So it's very important to make use of this mechanic because it's going to save you a lot of mana in the long run. But there are going to be times when you have High Tide, for example. That's probably the main time you want to consider about hard casting Chain Heal when you have High Tide. Let's say in Mythic Plus, you're going to have a time where you proc High Tide and you have 2 charges and you're like, okay, I'm looking at totems that can proc it, but all the totems are on cooldown. And you're like, I'm just gonna have to hard cast it. Just an example. So let's say I'm gonna try and use up as much mana as possible to proc my High Tide. I'm gonna use up some of the totems here as well that proc Chain Heals with lively totems. So my High Tide should... Let's hope it's gonna happen now. My High Tide proc, I have 2 charges and I'm like, let's assume our totems are not available and you're like, I'm gonna have to hardcast this. Just look at Nature Swiftness. You can use Nature Swiftness to proc 1 charge of High Tide. You can use it on Chain Heal. You can use, for example, Totemic Recall to get a charge of your Healing Stream Totem or Cloudburst Totem and then press that, and that's also going to proc High Tide. So what I did there, I didn't have to pay any mana cost for those Chain Heals, and they were used to proc High Tide. So that is one way of optimizing your mana usage that will save you a lot of mana. But there will be times, again, where you do have High Tide proc, nothing's available, Nature Swiftness not available, and you will have to hardcast it. And there is no way about this because, keep in mind, a lot of people tend to forget that for some reason they think that High Tide is going to reduce the mana cost of your Chain Heals. It does not. It makes them more powerful, therefore it is better to use them. Chain Heal is still very expensive, especially if you're going to be hardcasting it. Always think twice. Should I hardcast a Chain Heal? And if it has High Tide, you have to consider it. If you have totems to proc it for you, you should use that instead. That's going to be a lifesaver in terms of mana management. Now let's talk about Surging Totem usage. It is a hefty boy. It costs 216,000 mana, and again, your usage should depend on the content you're doing. So if you're doing Mythic Plus content, you will be running something like Acid Rain. It's going to be a big portion of your overall damage, and you most likely want to keep your Surging Totem on cooldown. You want to make use of that Acid Rain damage. But when it comes to raiding, you might not be running Acid Rain, which means that there might be certain fights or portions of certain fights where nothing is really happening, no one's taking a lot of damage, and you might actually delay using your Surging Totem, which is going to, in the long run, save you some mana. It really depends on whether you're running Acid Rain or not. And on top of that, I've seen some people kind of writing comments about this, about Nature Swiftness. If you use Nature Swiftness and you press your Surging Totem, it's not going to reduce the mana cost of it or eliminate the mana cost of it, and it's actually going to consume it. So there are quite a few bugs for Resto Shaman, so keep that in mind. Another thing that is very, very, very important is to differentiate the different healing styles as Resto Shaman who's playing in Mythic Plus and Resto Shaman who's playing in raids. In Mythic Plus, your healing surge as Resto Shaman is going to be your bread and butter. Again, you have talents like Master of Elements. So if you can actually weave in a couple of lava bursts in between, that's going to give you stacks of Master of Elements. It can stack up to 2 times, and that's going to increase your next healing surge by 60%. So your healing surge is going to be your bread and butter when it comes to Mythic Plus healing as Totemic Resto Shaman, and that is fine. You're going to be casting a lot of it. And if you can, try and weave in your Master of Elements stacks in between to make it more powerful, and then spread Flame Shocks and all those good things with that talent. In raids, you're not going to run that talent. In raids, your healing surge could actually burn through mana quite fast. You're not really going to be casting healing surge in raids as much, or not even close as much. Outside of that, when you use your healing surge or when you use your Surging Totem, you're going to get 3 buffs. And one of the buffs is going to be your next healing wave or healing surge also heals an ally inside of your healing rate at 100% effectiveness. So when you do that in raids, you might cast a healing surge and that's going to consume this buff, which is fine. but you're not going to be using healing surges in raids as much as you do in Mythic Plus content. So just a quick summary of this section: because you're running different talents in Mythic Plus and raids, and we're primarily talking about Master of Elements, because you're not running, or most likely not running, Master of Elements in raid content, your healing surge usage should reflect that. Because of this, you're not going to be using healing surge as much in raid content, and you should be very careful about healing surge usage in raid. When you're doing Mythic Plus content, it's going to be very, very different. Now onto some of the more basic things in terms of mana potions. A lot of people, or a lot of Resto Shamans tend to use mana potions when it's honestly too late. If you're running fights, again, keep in mind, mana potion or potions have a 5-minute cooldown. So if you're doing fights, and there are fights, especially in Mythic raiding, that last 9 minutes long. Or for example, Heroic last boss in terms of Queen. I've done that boss quite a few times, and you can use a mana potion in phase 1 relatively early there, and you can possibly squeeze in a sit-down mana potion in the last phase when there's nothing really happening. Now the sit-down mana potion, if you can utilize that, if you can find times to use it, it's going to give you additional mana and something to kind of optimize about. So if you're running fights, especially in raid content that lasts really long time, you need to think about double usage of potions. Just don't leave it too late. Something to consider. On top of that, if you have an evoker, source of magic can be something that you want to try and get from them. On top of that, if you're running with druids, try and get innervates. A lot of the top end mythic raiding bosses that last really long time, Resto Shamans are getting innervates, they are getting source of magic, because Totemic Resto Shaman, again, like I mentioned, is relatively mana hungry. No matter what you do, you have to play very, very efficiently. So the summary of the whole video in terms of the talents that I talked about and in terms of the mana tips and tricks, honestly, the best thing you can do in terms of conserving your mana is allowing your totems to cast the chain heals for you. The only time you want to really consider hard casting chain heals is going to be during high tide, and then you also have to ask yourself, can a totem do it for me instead in order to save that bit of mana? Using your mana potions as much as possible if you can squeeze in both of them, getting buffs from other people. In Mythic Plus content, you're using a lot of healing surges. In raid, you should refrain from using healing surges. Again, we talked about proccing your buffs from surging totem. You can do that, but generally speaking, healing surge should be something that has limited usage in raids. And outside of that, again, using your mana tide totem, if you do spec into mana tide totem, try to use it as much as possible and things like that. There is ways of trying to squeeze or save as much mana as possible as Totemic, and you can definitely, for example, based on my experience in Mythic Plus content, for these weekly keys, I've been running Totemic, and there hasn't been a single time where I ran out of mana on a boss fight. I do have to drink as Totemic Resto Shaman in Mythic Plus content. I am using these tips and tricks. I do have a 4-set bonus and things like that. Again, I'm drinking, but I'm not really running out of mana completely, which is, again, something that allows me to play Totemic Resto Shaman in Mythic Plus content. In raiding content on these high-end mythic raiding bosses like the egg boss, I have a lot of issues. I might actually try out Farseer. If you try these tips and tricks and it doesn't work for you, you always have an option of playing Farseer. Farseer is a lot more efficient, and if you know how to play, Farseer can also be a joy to play. Let me know how you feel about this. Let me know if you found other tips and tricks or ways of improving your mana as Totemic. If you like this video, like and subscribe. It really helps out the channel, and I'll see you in my next video.